Should members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints be considered Christians? It's a question that, of course, has been around since the very founding of the Latter-day Saint movement, but it's taken on added significance in recent years due to events that I've covered in previous videos. I've done a video on the Department of Defense issuing a new classification system for religious affiliation and not identifying Latter-day Saints as Christian. I've done a video or several videos on the Latter-day Saint institution in the last few decades, trying to do more to emphasize its Christian commonalities with the broader movement for both religious and cultural reasons. But I thought I'd take a step back in this week's video in response to a recent development. Doug Wilson, the preferred pastor of the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, was asked by the Salt Lake Tribune about his views on Mormonism recently. And when asked, should Mormons be able to hold office, Douglas Wilson responded that in an ideal world, only Orthodox Christians should be able to hold office. And then when asked what would Latter-day Saints have to do to be considered Orthodox Christian, what he immediately brought up is the LDS doctrine of theosis, or deification, or the famous Lorenzo Snow couplet, as man is, God once was, as God is, man may become, as an evidence that Latter-day Saints do not operate within this historical umbrella as Mormonism, a strong segment of evangelicalism that has been around for a long time, of viewing Mormons this way, of Doug Wilson as just the most recent and perhaps most influential version. Now, I'll note from the outset, before I dig into the meat of this discussion, that I have a little patience for this evangelical narrow definition of who does and does not get to belong as Christian. They don't own a monopoly on the term. There is no broader, universally agreed upon idea of what a Christian entails. Even the arguments that to be a Christian you need to believe in a certain creed is a prescriptive rather than descriptive idea with political baggage. It also erases a much longer, more complicated, and diverse history of Christianity that gets forgotten in this modern creation of what being a Christian actually means. I'll also note that I don't think Latter-day Saints should care what the broader evangelical world, especially those with these very narrow and often bigoted definitions of Christianity, I don't think they should care what they think, and they should instead focus on what they define as a good Christian life or good Christian doctrine should be. Now, what I do want to cover in this video is a group of scholars over the past few decades who have tried to chart another way. A number of professors and pastors and academics, both evangelical and LDS, who've tried to address this question of interreligious dialogue, even defining the boundaries of Christianity, with a bit more nuance. A movement that started in the 1980s with a handful of people at BYU and evangelical institutions that have only become more prominent in recent years. And though their discussions aren't widely known, I do believe that their impact has been immense in both camps. So I hope to shed some light today on what I see as a more sophisticated model over definitions of Christianity and how Mormonism fits within that picture. I hope I don't have to do too much historical background to explain the mutual distrust that evangelicals and Mormons have with each other or toward each other. That has been around since Mormonism was founded and Joseph Smith was cast as a heretic. It, of course, escalated in the 20th century, particularly with the growth of the anti-cult movement within evangelicalism in the 1970s and 1980s. Think Ed Decker's The God Makers, among many other books I did highlight. But instead, I want to talk about the people who tried to respond to that movement and offer a different way. Now, I could identify a number of crucial voices in this movement, but I'm only going to highlight a few, and just a couple in this first section. The first is Stephen L. Robinson. Robinson is an LDS New Testament scholar, received his PhD from Duke University, and he first taught and was tenured at a Christian school, Lycoming College out in the East. He would later join the BYU religion department and become quite influential in those circles in both teaching how Latter-day Saints should read the scripture, defending the church through apologetics, apologetics, but he also modeled a form of interreligious dialogue that would be quite crucial for the coming movement that I'm discussing. He argued that not only should Latter-day Saints be open to scholarship produced by those outside the faith, especially scholarship on the New Testament, but they should be interested in talking about things like grace and salvation and Christianity that pulls from this much more vibrant tradition and can help Latter-day Saints understand what they really believe and where they belong. Some of the early fruits of this initiative were his 1992 Ensign article, Believing Christ, which would soon become a best-selling book with Deseret Book. You might be familiar with it and its very famous Parable of the Bicycle, which tries to erase so much of the chasm between Latter-day Saint notions of atonement and Christ and broader Christianity. And this came at a very opportune time in the Latter-day Saint tradition. I'm sure there can be a chicken and the egg effect of which came first, the LDS Church trying to emphasize its Christian bona fides, or Stephen L. Robinson providing a scholarly, rigorous way to do that very thing. But they ended up working together. And there were those outside of the LDS tradition that also really appreciated what Robinson was performing. Among those was Craig Blomberg, an evangelical scholar of the New Testament who teaches, I believe he still teaches, at Denver Theological Seminary. And they started entering into a dialogue, trying to find out what do Latter-day Saints and evangelicals really hold in common and where do they diverge. And the result of their dialogue was a groundbreaking book published in 1997 by the Evangelical Press InterVarsity Press titled How Wide the Divide? A Mormon and an Evangelical in Conversation. And it would be difficult to overstate the newness of that volume that modeled a type of dialogue that had not existed up until that point. The book focused on four main topics: Scripture, God and deification, Christ and the Trinity, and salvation. I would start with statements from both sides, then addressing misconceptions that they have one toward the other, and then a movement toward a more positive understanding of trying to recognize the grace and the benefits and the beauties of each other's theology before having a joint conclusion of what they can agree upon, what they diverge from, but most importantly, having a better sentiment of what the other side holds true, rather than believing in stereotypes and caricatures. They urged fellow believers within their various groups to avoid terms like cult when it comes to evangelicals talking about Mormonism, or abominable church when it comes to Mormons talking about other Christian churches. And they believe that this real dialogue can only take place with an honest and generous exchange, truly understand what the other side believes rather than relying on gross mischaracterizations. And that discussion was very exciting for many in both camps, even while there were others who had plenty to critique about it. Before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of content, using the history to understand the world around us and how we got to this point, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday, I connect the past to the present every Wednesday, and then on Fridays I pull back the curtain on the historian's craft, either talking about classic works in the field, interviewing authors of new books, or looking at the sources behind common arguments so that you too can have a strong historical take based on the craft of history. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you can get early access to videos, little icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing scholarship that helps us understand why history still matters and why it's still relevant. I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter. I send out notices every other week or so with links and updates and announcements, and you can follow me on my different social media platforms, especially Instagram, where I provide supplemental information and often prompt very vigorous conversations. But that's enough business. Let's get back to today's topic at hand. I think it's fair to say that the book How Wide the Divide prompted lots of, let's call it, vigorous reactions from both sides of the divide, including many who were not very happy with the dialogue taking place in the first place. That includes criticisms coming from the Latter-day Saint tradition. Those who argued, was Robinson selling out Latter-day Saint doctrines in order to find commonality? Was he downplaying their exceptionalist claims? Should we even trust evangelicals to dialogue with? And some in Robinson's own department of religion at BYU BYU. There are some, like Joseph Fielding McConkie, the son of Bruce R. McConkie, who denounce this whole enterprise as wrong, as false, as something that is a waste of time. And Craig Blomberg received similar reactions from his evangelical friends, some saying that why are you even speaking to these cultists? They accused Robinson of avoiding unchristian doctrines and Blomberg for not making him pin down on things like theosis. They said that the dialogue itself was granting too much visibility and respectability to the Mormons, and there were therefore some who argue that we need to re-engage in this anti-cult warfare so that no one can be confused by the pious generosity that is wrong-headed coming from Blomberg. I'm quoting from a few of those evangelical critics. But even while there were many who were not happy or comfortable, there were others who wanted to build on that type of dialogue. And now I want to highlight a few others. At BYU, you have Robert Millet, who was a professor of religion, known for his doctrinal teachings, had previously co-written a lot of stuff with Joseph Fielding McConkie, who now felt drawn to finding these commonalities with Christians, something that his former co-author, Joseph Fielding McConkie, was not too pleased with. And then on the evangelical side, you had people like Richard Mouw, who would eventually become president of the Fuller Theological Seminary, who was very devoted to building these harmonious relationships. I'll have more on him in a bit. And so these people come together and they start annual meetings that would take place sometimes in Mormons settings, sometimes in evangelical settings, dialoguing on particular topics, finding what they could agree on, where they diverge, and can we have more harmonious relationships one with another. And I think there's some key highlights that come out of these dialogues that continue to persist, by the way, all the way until now. They focus on attacking common stereotypes and caricatures, arguing once again that even if we don't agree on everything, we should at least have a firm understanding of what the other believes. 2, better understanding each other's positions, why they are seen as so valuable, why others might see it as graceful rather than just denouncing them within this heretical confound. They also found better language for their theology, saying that, oh, maybe you actually have this verbiage or these ideas that might paper over our key differences, but actually allow us to have a shared understanding. And more importantly, it created a better relationships across communities. I attended one of these such gatherings when I was an undergraduate student at BYU. Not one of the formal ones put on by the academics, but local ones put on by pastors, where they brought in a lot of evangelical students and Mormon students and debating on various topics, but in ways that brought respect. It wasn't my cup of tea, but I could see the value in it, and I came away very impressed, saying that this is the type of dialogue that can put aside differences and try to better understand people's ideas on their own terms. In other words, avoiding this very parochial definition of you're not Christian, you're a cult, you're heretical, that seems to dominate public discourse. Perhaps the best thing that has come out of this multi-decade dialogue by this point is the creation of so many important books that really provide the foundation for people who want to understand better Mormonism and its relationship to American Christianity and where it aligns and where it diverges. And I want to highlight all these books because this is outside of my own personal expertise or focus. And I want to give you some text to where if you want to read it yourself, you know where to go. And importantly, most of these are published by evangelical presses, something that would have been unheard of before the book How Wide the Divide, but this provided a vantage point for evangelical presses who previously would have just published anti-Mormon books, now recognizing that maybe we can have a better understanding of them and maybe even learn from them. Just to highlight a few, you have Robert Millet and Garrett McDermott's Claiming Christ, a Mormon Evangelical Debate, published by Brazos Press. This is very much like the Robinson and Blomberg book, where it captures a dialogue between one another, trying to understand where they agree and where they diverge and putting their perspectives on print. Millet and McDermott have taken this dialogue on the road for decades, speaking to various different audiences. And so it's good to have an in-print version of what that type of dialogue can look like. And then you have a few people who are offering a much more generous approach from purely an evangelical background of why it is important to, one, understand the Latter-day Saints, and two, have kind relations with them. Among those are Richard Mouw, remember the president of the Fuller Theological Seminary, who wrote his book, Talking with Mormons, an invitation to evangelicals, published by Erdman's, arguably the top evangelical press. And to give you a sense of what the tenor of this work looks like, this is what he said. My main concern, and what I've been saying thus far, is to invite us to nurture friendlier relations with the Mormon community. I want us to listen carefully to our Mormon neighbors without deciding ahead of time what they really believe. Patience, humility, a willingness to admit our own shortcomings, all of these are necessary to move the dialogue forward. But I'm not suggesting that by forming more positive relations, all of our differences will magically melt away. So again, note both a generosity of wanting to engage, while still acknowledging that this does not mean we're all going to agree together. If you want to see someone who takes us to the next step, you have another Christian scholar, Stephen Webb, who published with Oxford University Press, Mormon Christianity, What Other Christians Can Learn from the Latter-day Saints, which argues that not only is it important for Christians to understand the Mormons, but it's important to actually learn from the Mormons. You can see how this is moving beyond even just basic dialogue to actual engagement. And I think those books kind of capture this movement. If you want a more academic overview of these overlaps and divergences, Donald Musser and David Paulson published a book with Mercer Press, Mormonism and Dialogue with Contemporary Christian Theologies. Every chapter is focused on a different theme, whether it be process theology or salvation. This is a lot more academic. It's got a lot more heft. I will note, in reading through this volume, I took a number of philosophy courses that allowed me to kind of dig into this stuff. You could see a bit of a frustration on the part of some of the Christian scholars who felt the Mormons were willing to provide an overview of the LDS theology, but never willing to concede various points. And that's a continuing theme or tension at the heart of a lot of these discussions. And then perhaps one of the culminations of these decades-long conversations is Grant Underwood, a professor of history at BYU who participated in a lot of these conversations, published just last year with Erdman's, again, the top evangelical press, Latter-day Saint Theology Among Christian Theologies. It's massive and magisterial and really covers all the major doctrines of Christianity, shows where Latter-day Saints fit in, where they diverge, and really helps us understand how the definitions of Christianity have evolved, which has severe repercussions for the Latter-day Saints. That's not to say there aren't limits with the book. It's very institutional. It's very much focused on a particular type of scholarship that may be a bit dated now, but it really is probably the textbook if you want to understand the results of these discussions and how Latter-day Saints fit into the broader Christian picture. So in other words, there are lots of really important books on this very topic that I really wish people like Douglas Wilson could engage. So a few concluding thoughts before I finish this video. First, I'm going to give one more book recommendation because I think it really captures the historical perspective, whereas most of what I've been covering is more theological and interreligious. John Turner, the historian that you know for his wonderful biographies of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, actually wrote a biography of the Mormon Jesus, titled The Mormon Jesus, a Biography. It's really, really great. It's published by Harvard University Press, and it's not just an analysis of Mormon doctrines of Christianity, but it's also using that as a springboard to examine what is historical Christianity in the first place. So it starts with the Mormon teaching, then it'll go way back into Christian teachings, finding how there has been lots of debate over this issue, and then how Mormons try to solve this. Of course, John Turner is a non-Mormon Protestant Christian, so he's coming from a very generous perspective. And what I love about this book that I strongly recommend, and I wish it was as well known as his Joseph Smith and Brigham Young biographies, is that it shows that Christianity has always been far more diverse than these narrow definitions that are so common today seem to imply. So what are some of the lessons that we can get from these decades of dialogue between Mormons and evangelicals? One is I hope that at least in some circles, there are more generous and accurate assessments of competing viewpoints. Two, I hope that it removes some of the edge of the attacks of the critiques from the Mormon angle, not just announcing broader Christianity as apostate, and from the evangelical angle, denouncing Mormons as cult and Christian. I think there are also some lasting institutional legacies. There are now Mormons who attend evangelical schools, whether it be Baylor or Wheaton. I could name a number of really important scholars from the Mormon tradition who now have a space in these evangelical places that would not prior to these dialogues. And fourth and finally, I think we are seeing these evangelical presses willing to engage on Mormon topics. I highlighted a few in the last section, but I'll highlight one that's coming out next year by Jonathan Stapley and Spencer McBride, two historians at the Church History Library. They have a book coming out with Erdman's Press, remember, the best press in the evangelical world, titled Inside the Temple, What Latter-day Saints Do in Their Most Sacred Spaces, an overview of Latter-day Saint ritual theology in an evangelical press that's not an anti-Mormon book. I think that book is a testament, a fruit of these decades of work that I think is quite important. That's not to say there aren't limits to these movements. I think there are still plenty of critics in both the evangelical and Mormon camps wondering, does this dialogue require too many concessions? Is theology taking less prominence in either of these groups? As I've covered in many of my videos, Christianity is now defined more along cultural terms rather than theological terms, which means is all this theological work for naught? And finally, I'm not sure that those who are defining Mormonism as a cult, like Douglas Wilson, are actually interested in understanding and accurately deciphering what Mormon theology is. And further, I don't think they're actually interested in deciphering the long and complicated history of Christianity. In other words, the Douglas Wilson position that tries to define Mormonism as unchristian is often both ignorant of Mormonism as well as ignorant of Christianity, and I'm not sure that's going to change. So to reiterate some key points that I started this video with, but I think that it's important enough to close it with as well. There is no definitive definition of Christianity. Evangelicals do not get carte blanche to just define that Christianity means belonging to this creed or not believing in this doctrine. Two, that term has become less theological in recent years, which means a lot of these theological discussions might be beside the point. And third, I wish Latter-day Saints would stop caring about trying to convince these often small-minded evangelicals who are defining Christianities in ways that suit their political purposes, but do not match the actual historical record. I hope this video helped in these broader conversations. If you have any questions or your own definitions of Christianity, let me know in the comments. But I hope this topic reaffirms why history is still relevant, because it helps us understand, bring context to these debates that might seem new today, but are anything but new when looked within the broader traditions.